Hi there. I'm Monika Kelly. This is Green Light Podcast. And in case you just tuned in for the first time, I am a follower of Jesus. I'm a mom, I'm a wife, and I'm so glad you're here. And if you could like and subscribe to this channel and just let your friends know that there is some good news that we're about to talk to. And my guest today is Joesy Pineda. And it's good to have you, Joesy.
Well, thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Now, do we still call you pastor?
I have the title, but I don't really need to be called that. Just call me by my name.
So the first time I ever saw you was on stage at Victory Outreach Santa Rosa, probably, I'm going to say at least 20 years ago. And I was so impressed with you. And of course, you had no idea who I was. I then saw you in the halls of a very large radio network, and you were interviewing for a job. And I started to chase you down the hall and say, hire her. She's amazing. But you have a whole testimony. And I would love to hear a little bit about, your life before Jesus and what God did to bring you into the kingdom.
Okay, well, thank you for having me, for allowing me the opportunity to share God's blessing in my life. I was born and raised in East LA. I am the oldest of 9 children. Grew up kind of poor, 2 bedrooms with 9 kids. My 3 brothers slept in the washroom, no more room. And I grew up in an alcoholic family. Both my parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, just family, were all alcoholics. And when I was just turned 17, my parents had gotten married very young. They actually got married when they were 17 because I was on the way. And they were both juniors going into seniors in high school. And so my mom dropped out. My dad went to work. And when they separated, when I was 17, I had done a lot of the cooking, a lot of the cleaning, a lot of the babysitting. 13 years old, watching 8 kids was a little difficult. And so, but my parents had some marital problems. He wound up leaving, and I wound up going with him because I just didn't want to stay home. But as I said, he was an alcoholic, and he was 35 years old, and he literally drank himself to death. That's when he died. And wow. We were living in a hotel, me and him. I was sleeping in the closet. In the kitchen, and he was sleeping in the room. And so when he left to the hospital, I was in the motel by myself. When he died, I stayed in the motel by myself. It wasn't a very upscale motel because I had to sleep with a machete underneath my pillow. So it was pretty bad, but I never stopped going to school. That was one of my dad's wishes on his deathbed, that I would not stop going to school. And I went 12 years to Catholic school. So nobody knew that I was living on my own except my close friends. They couldn't tell anybody because then they would have to cause me to leave because I wasn't living with a parent. So it was a real hush-hush thing. And I was grieving, but I didn't even know what I was going through. I was kind of like in a fog because my dad died in September of my senior year. I just started. I'd only been there 2 weeks. And it was really like a real difficult time because I didn't know what grief was. I didn't understand it. And in November, my aunt, who also had 9 kids, my father's sister, told me she wanted me to come live with them. And I already had been on my own for the last 3-4 months. And I really didn't want to, but holidays were coming. I didn't want to be by myself. So I went to live with her, but it actually took me further away from my school. It took me 45 minutes by bus to get to school. So I'm taking 2 buses now. And it was at one of those intersections of the buses that I met this woman. And she started talking to me about Jesus. And I was wearing my high school Catholic school uniform. And she comes up to me and says, "Do you know God?" And I'm looking at her like, out of all the people here at the bus stop, why do you come to me? Because there are a lot of nutty people in LA. I mean, a lot. And I said, "Of course I know God. Look, I have my religion book." She goes, "No, do you know the God who can change a drug addict, a God who can change a gang member?" And I looked at her and I'm like, this lady doesn't know what she's talking about, because I grew up around drug addicts. My brother was a gang member. I grew up around prostitutes. I mean, it was just part of my life. Not my lifestyle, but just a part of my life. And so I just smiled at her and kind of walked away and tried to avoid her. And I kept seeing her every morning. And every morning she'd make a beeline for me. And every morning I'd do my best to run away from her. And this kept going on for probably about 2 months. And I was 1 month away from turning 18. And I said, you know what? I can't live here with my 9 cousins anymore, because it's just really getting crazy. There were 10 of us and 9 of us were teenagers.
Oh my word.
Yeah, it was crazy. But so I remembered this lady that she had given me her number if I ever needed help. So I said, I think I could handle living there. This is my mind thinking. I'm my 17-year-old mind. I could handle living there for a few weeks before I turn 18, and then I'm on my own, and nobody can tell me nothing. I'm doing it. So I called her. I didn't even know her name. I just said, "Remember, I'm the girl from the bus stop." She goes, "Oh, yes, God told me you were going to call me today." And I'm like, oh no, God talks to her now. So I said, "Yeah, I just need a place for just a few weeks." And she goes, "I'll pick you up." So she came, picked me up, went over there. And she said one of the responsibilities that I had was to go to church. And I was thinking in my mind, I grew up a Catholic. And I was taught that if I ever walked into another church, God would strike me dead.
Oh my goodness.
That was the fear. It was like old school.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I believed. And I'm like, I can't tell her this. So the first service, I couldn't go. I had a headache. The second service, I couldn't go. I had too much homework. The third service, I had a stomachache. I mean, it just made up excuse after excuse after excuse. Finally, she said, "You have to go Sunday night." And Sunday night was really in the afternoon, about 4:00. So I said, "Okay, I'll meet you over there." Had my friend pick me up, and we went to the church, and it was Victory Outreach.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And it was their first church, and it was dilapidated. It was falling apart. It was holes in the floor. It was pretty bad. But I had never been to any other church in my life except a Catholic church. So I walked in, and just as God would have it, there were no 2 seats together. We couldn't sit together. So there was 1 seat in the back and 1 seat in the front, in the 3rd row. And I'm like, okay, I'll go sit up there. And she says, "Okay, we're going to leave in 10 minutes. So I said, all right, I'll just let her see my face that I showed up, and then we'll leave. And so she sat in the back. And so after 10, 15 minutes, an usher came and tapped me on the shoulder. And he said, "Your friend said to tell you she wants to go." And I turned around and I looked at her and I go, 5 more minutes, just 5 more minutes. And so she said, okay. So then I'm listening, and it was testimony time. And it was so different for me because people were saying, I used to be a drug addict. I used to be a heroin addict. I used to be an alcoholic. And in my mind, I'm thinking, these people are lying. You can't change. That's impossible. My dad died from alcoholism. I have friends and relatives that are addicts. It was just like, it was surprising to me. And so the usher comes again and says, your friend said she's leaving. And I turned around and I said, okay, I'll see you. Bye. And she left, and I wound up going to the altar that night. But one thing I will remember is that people go up to the altar and they ask Jesus into their heart. I didn't. What I went to the altar for, which just chokes me up just to even think about it, is that I asked him to teach me how to love, because I just didn't know how. I knew how to be angry. I knew how to fight. I knew how to push people away, but I didn't know how to love. And that was over 51 years ago. And I gave my life to Jesus. And it's been an adventure, because I met my husband, who was an ex-heroin addict, in church. We got married. 5 years after, we went to pastor up in the Bay Area, and in Hayward, pastored there 22 years together. And then the Lord took him home. And so my son was like 21 years old, and my husband and I had always talked about turning the church over to him, but he was too young. So I asked permission to take over the church, and they gave me permission. I took it over. I was the first woman, only woman, to ever pastor in this ministry. And I did it for 8.5 years. During those 8.5 years, he got married. He had a kid. He had 2 kids. And so I said, okay, he's ready. So I turned the church over. And then that's when I moved up to Sacramento. And you saw me at the radio station looking for a job.
Well, there's so many questions I have, going back to being in the motel with your dad. And I mean, you're 17, he's 35, he's an alcoholic. What was life like on a day-to-day basis at that point?
I didn't know what an alcoholic was in my mind, because I knew Skid Row. I lived in LA, so I was very familiar with Skid Row alcoholics. But my dad was not like that. He was always home, and he would drink at home, and he would pass out at home. He actually held down 2 jobs.
Wow.
So he was, I guess, what you would call a functioning alcoholic. And only on the weekends would him and my mom just kind of go off the deep end with alcohol. But other than that, he was functioning. I mean, he drank before he went to work. He drank during work. He drank when he came home. But it got to the point where he was drinking just to be able to function.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, and then I know you've talked before to me personally about your mom being involved in, I don't know if she was involved in witchcraft or she was a medium.
Well, she did tarot cards along with my grandmother taught her. And so my mom did that, and she believed in a lot of the whole Santeria, that whole thing. And it was really something, because if you know anything about Santeria and the tarot cards, and as a young girl growing up, I was like fascinated with it, because that stuff came true. It really did. And so it was kind of like, and I was like, Grandma, teach me. And she says, when you get older. But when I got older, I got saved. And it was not even interesting to me anymore to know, but that influence was there. And I just I repelled it. I don't want anything to do with it. Never did anything with it. But I just really, just gave my life to the Lord, where there's not even a desire at all.
It's pretty amazing to think that, the type of environment, I mean, your parents obviously loved you, but they were lost. And then, for you to be so resilient as a child, all on your own at 17, still going to school, showing up every day, willing to take 2 buses. And for somebody who's watching right now and has never heard of Victory Outreach and doesn't know the history, there's a fascinating history of how Victory Outreach got started. Can you kind of give us an overview?
Sure. Well, my pastor was the first drug addict out of Teen Challenge in 1962 with David Wilkerson. And at that time, David Wilkerson was the director, and Nicky Cruz was in charge. And he's the one that actually led my pastor to the Lord, walked him through his, what you would call withdrawals from his heroin addiction. And through that, he got clean, he got saved, he got sanctified, delivered. And then David sent him to La Puente in California. He wanted to get him out of New York. And so he met his wife, Julie, in La Puente at Bible school, and they got married. And the Lord laid it upon my pastor's heart, Sonny, to develop a church for drug addicts, which nobody had ever done. Nobody had ever even heard of a ministry to drug addicts at that time. But that's what the Lord laid on his heart. And so he did. He went to the neighborhood, the neighborhood in Boyle Heights.
The barrio, yeah.
The barrio, yeah. And opened up his home. Not even the church, opened up his home.
Wow.
To drug. And as they started coming in, then that's when he opened up a church, and they started ministering to them and their families. And that's how it's taken off. And it's been in existence 56 years, 57 years, because I've been here 51. So, yeah.
And what's amazing to me about your story and the story of Victory Outreach, for if you are not familiar with it, there's a book called Run Baby Run, about Nicky Cruz and his life.
Right.
That he was from Puerto Rico. He comes from a family heavily involved with witchcraft.
Heavily involved.
Very
yes.
dark. Comes to New York City, was a gang leader. David Wilkerson was at home minding his own business. I think he was fasting TV, and God spoke to him and said, "Go to New York City, find this gang leader, minister
he's from
to him."
Pennsylvania.
Yeah, which is crazy.
They don't have drug addicts and gang members in Pennsylvania at that time. But that's where God told David to go and to confront these young men who were on trial. That's where God sent him. He sent him to court to minister to these young boys who were on trial.
Isn't that
God
crazy?
gave him heart for the gang member, heart for the drug addict.
And what's amazing to me, so God is so strategic. This man from Pennsylvania goes into this area that he's not familiar with, ministers to people that are potentially very, very dangerous at that time. They accept Jesus. Nicky Cruz has a radical change, who has gone on to minister to millions of people all over the world, written multiple books, and then to really help Sonny rehab from a terrible addiction. God knew that the people, all the thousands of people all over the world, would be impacted by Victory Outreach. And, and you're a history maker. And that's why I was excited to have you on. I mean, the only female pastor in Victory Outreach ever, first and only. And just your faithfulness. God has done something recently in your life where you had a job for a while, and then you're like, I don't know what's next. And what happened?
Well, I knew that there's always been, I guess, a connection between me and God, that he puts a restless spirit inside of me but I didn't know where this restlessness was coming from because I kind of enjoyed what I was doing. I was pastoring, but it was more online than anything else. But I still had a restlessness. And so there was an evangelist that came to our church, and he pulled me out of the congregation. And he said, God says to pack your bags. And I just kind of like looked at him, and he said, he wants to take you on the road, and he's going to use you in a totally different way. You have been in front, and now you're going to be in a supporting role. And now you're going to be able to influence others in a different way. You're going to be able to talk to people that you would not normally have known or been influenced by or been able to touch. But this is how God is going to use you now. And so I was kind of like, I didn't know what was going on. So then I have a friend and who worked with my husband in evangelism, and that's Mario Murillo. And he called me out of the sky blue one day and said, hey, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm just kind of like thinking about what God is doing. And, there's an opening in Tennessee that a company is going there. And so he said, Tennessee? I said, yeah. He goes, guess what? I just moved to Tennessee. I said, what? He goes, don't work for them, come work for me. And I'm like, I think this is where God has me. So I said, well, let me go check it out. So I came to Tennessee from California, and I just had the peace of God. And that's something that I've made a lot of moves in my life, moving from LA to the Bay Area to pastor with my husband. And I always had that security that God was taking me. And it's like I wouldn't go to the next step until I could feel that this is where God had me. And then moving from the Bay Area to the Sacramento area, I knew that that was God. And then from Sacramento area to Tennessee. But I knew that I knew that I knew that this is where God was taking me. And so I've been here almost 2 years, and I'm kind of liking it. It took a little time to acclimate here because it is slow. Slow. But I'm really kind of liking it. I really am.
And it's awesome. First of all, your testimony, your ongoing testimony. I remember when you got that call from Mario Murillo, and just the perfection and the timing and the care, that I'll never forget him sharing with you that God, wanted to make sure. God obviously wants us to take care of widows and orphans, and you're a widow. And he has just had such strategic care of you. He's really, it makes me want to cry. Like, it's such a testimony. And if anybody doesn't know who Mario Murillo is, he is one of the leading evangelists in the world and doing tent revivals where people are showing up out of nowhere off the streets. Talk to us a little bit about what you've been seeing happening at some of these revivals.
Well, it's amazing how God uses Mario. He uses him in divine healings, and he gives him a word of knowledge. The Lord will show him someone in the crowd, and he'll say, you have 10 things wrong with you, your heart, neuropathy, and your cramps. I mean, he'll just name it, and people are just like in awe, like, how did you know? Well, it's not him, it's the Holy Spirit showing him, but they get healed. And I have talked to and read letters of people who have been healed, totally 100% healed. And all he is a vessel, but I'll tell you, God uses him in a tremendous way. I feel like God has taken me from the inner city of believing for a drug addict, believing for a prostitute, believing for a gang member, to now bigger opportunities to see healings of not just physical, but mental and emotional and physical. it's been awesome. And, you know, when talk about the faithfulness of God, it's been over 20 years that my husband has gone home to be with the Lord. And in 20 years, only word that I could use to describe God is faithful. He's just been faithful. And I'm glad to be a part of what God is doing in these last days. You know, there's no such thing as retiring in God. There's no such thing. So I have an opportunity to keep going forward and keep doing things for the kingdom.
And one of the things, I mean, thank you for sharing that. And you know, I was just thinking as you were talking about how whenever you pray, I don't know what you say to God, but it's like things get handled like that. Whenever I've asked for prayer, it's like Pastor Joesy prayers are different. You know, they just hit different. God's like, okay, I hear you. But what's your role now? So you said you're behind the scenes. What do you get to do?
Well, I'm Mario's personal assistant, so I do all the background stuff. And so I get to talk to people, get to read their letters, get to, you know, I do a little bit of everything as an assistant with the banking and the emails and the letters and just, you know, joining hands with people believing for healing. And I get to do a little bit of everything now. So it's like, there's no day that's the same. It's just all different. So it's a great opportunity.
That's so nice. And then you've always talked about Jesus really being your husband. You know, you talk about having been a widow for 20 years. And I'm sure there's a lot of women listening maybe that are thinking, how do I navigate life without my husband? What do I do? You know, when he was there to take care of me. And
yeah, it's a transition. And I didn't realize how much I depended on my husband until he was no longer there for me to depend on him. And I realized that I had put him in a place, and sometimes in that place where God belonged. When I should have been looking to him, I was looking to my husband. And so that whole transition of he is my security, he is my source, he is my rock, he is my friend, but he is my husband. And so my relationship with the Lord in the last 20 years has been totally transformed. I think I'm on the road. It's like serving him for 51 years. I think the last maybe 15, 20 years have been the best because it's just really been me and him. And so
and your dog.
And my dogs. I have two of them.
And you have two?
Yes. And they're wrestling. You can hear them in the background. And but it's different. I wake up in the morning and I look forward to spending my time with him. I really do. It's kind of like brush my teeth, grab my coffee, and sit down and have my time with him. And I just look forward to it, which before, you know, life got in the way, just life. And now it's just me and him.
Because I have cheap Zoom, we're almost out of time. Free, I should say free. You have had a piece about you since I've known you, just a tremendous piece. You've lost people since I've known you, dear people, your mom and siblings, and which makes me want to cry too, because you've been such a living example of what it means to have peace that passes all understanding. If somebody's listening right now and they're experiencing the opposite, maybe anxiety or depression, what would you say to them?
Well, I know the pain of having loved ones no longer here with you, starting with my husband, two sisters during COVID, my mom last year, Thanksgiving. So I think the only thing that I can tell you is that, first of all, grief is very personal and it's very individual. And I talk to women all the time, consistently, who are going through their times of grief. And I tell them to find others who they can lock arms with, who they can get encouraged by. That's why the Bible says, not to neglect the assembling of the saints together, whereby we encourage one another. It's not because we can't sing in our home. It's not because we can't worship in our home. It's because we need each other. We need to lock arms with each other. He created us for each other. And so I would encourage those who are anticipating this Thanksgiving and holiday season with a little bit of emptiness, because maybe they have an empty chair, or they're going to anticipate an empty chair at Thanksgiving or an empty chair at Christmas. Anticipate filling that chair with someone else, someone who is in need, someone who would enjoy being invited. And then going out of your way and not making it so much about, poor me, I don't have this and I don't have that. There are so many people who are in need. And I remember the first Thanksgiving when my husband was not around, I didn't want to experience an empty chair. What I did is I invited anybody from the church who wanted to come. Anybody. And the whole table was filled. So I know that there are people that either can be a part of your life, but don't make it so much about you as much as about what others. Encourage someone else. Push someone else to do what God wants them to do.
Well, thank you again for your time. Thank you, Pastor Joesy Pineda, which I'm like, I want to give your website out. You don't have a website, right? Well, thank you for coming on Greenlight.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I've enjoyed it.
Well, I hope you have a great Thanksgiving. If I don't talk to you, I probably will talk to you, but thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I pray you have a blessed Thanksgiving, you and your husband and Joshua.
Okay, I'm going to